Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. On Sunday, Haitians voted for the first time in 4 years in legislative elections. So think of this as the equivalent of U.S. congressional elections. But Haiti's parliament has not been in session since January after scheduled legislative elections in 2011 and 2014 were canceled, thereby leaving Haiti's President Michel Martelli essentially ruling by decree. Now joining us from Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, to give us the perspective on the ground is Jake Johnston. He is a research associate at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and he's the lead blogger for Haiti Relief and Reconstruction Watch. Also joining us via phone from Haiti is Francois Pierre-Louis. Francois is an associate professor of political science at Queens College in New York. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So, Jake, I'm going to start off with you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. So, Jake, I want to start out with you. You're on the ground. You were going to different polling stations. Many international reports highlight the lower voter turnout and the violence around at certain polling stations during these elections. Did you share the same experiences? And if so, do we have a sense of who is behind these disturbances?
Yeah, sure. So, again, I was in the Capitol. I went to probably between a dozen and 15 polling centers throughout the day. It was a mixed bag. At some of the smaller ones, things seemed to be going relatively smoothly. There were the problems many expected beforehand, people not being able to find their names on voter lists, material showing up late in some cases, polling stations opening up late, problems with the ink, voting twice. I think what the biggest issue was across the board was this issue with political party observers. It was announced just the day before the election that there would only be 5 allowed per voting booth, and this caused a lot of tension, certainly in the morning. And again, at some polling centers, certainly in an area of Cité Soleil, there was quite a bit of violence, and entire voting centers, including the two largest in Cité Soleil, were both closed. One of them was ransacked by armed men who had showed up and just sort of littered the entire place with ballots.
Okay, and the reports also mentioned the low voter turnout. Francois, it's been 4 years since there's been an election. Many political parties were demanding that they take place. Why are we seeing such a low voter turnout?
Well, I think the first reason is that a lot of people did not believe the elections would take place at all. And secondly, the CEPR had promised, and the government had pledged money to the political parties so they can mobilize their electorate, and that money did not come through. The third, you have the violence, and people were afraid to go out because there was a lot of rumors around the violence, and this did happen. And I would say the fourth reason also is that people are tired of, in a way, voting and not seeing any results in how the elections have changed their own lives. In fact, what has happened is that they realize the more they vote, the worse their lives have gotten in the past many years because they've been voting. So therefore, I think they've decided, to stay home. And also, seriously, the kind of candidates that were running, many of them did not really come up with any new alternatives. A lot of them were part of the regime. Some of them have criminal background. Some of them are running for office because they can find immunity in the office. So therefore, people were not really excited about going to vote for criminals to pass them in the house, like the same thing that happened 4 years ago.
So this is the first of 3 elections scheduled for 2015, and the one scheduled in October and the following in December will choose the new president. So I'm going to ask you, why did it take so long for us to even get these elections scheduled in the first place?
Well, I think there was a concerted effort on the part of the Martelli administration and also the international community to push for constitutional reform so that there would be fewer elections and fewer members in parliament. So as a result, they were playing on that side to cancel the election, postpone the election as much as possible. The other reason also is that Martelli, from the time he started to run, said publicly that he wasn't really cared that much about the election. And he really wanted to rule by decree because he thought having a strong man in the palace would solve Haiti's problems. So therefore, there was no real interest on the part of the government to do it. And the international community also was not in a rush to push for regular elections.
I'm glad you mentioned the international community, because we should also note that Haitian elections typically have both internal and external forces meddling in the results. One example is from one of your recent exposés, Jake. You found that the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, gave nearly $100,000 to a Haitian political movement with close ties to President Michel Martelli after the country's 2010 elections. Tell us a bit more about what exactly you found, and what other evidence do you have of this sort of American government supporting the Martelli administration?
Yeah, well, I think the story really starts with the first round election in November of 2010. It was soon after the earthquake. There was a cholera outbreak. It was an extremely difficult time to organize an election, and yet it was pushed forward. And in that election, there was, a lot of problems on election day. Many of the candidates had pledged to try and annul the vote entirely. Some of the leading candidates, including Martelli, were contacted by the international community and told they were leading the election. They sort of backed off their calls for it to be canceled. And what we saw after that was actually a mission from the OAS, which is also observing this election, came into Haiti and without any sort of statistical basis, essentially overturned the results of the election, which had prevented Martelli from going to the second round. And that was led predominantly by the United States, as well as some of the other members of the international community, including the UN contingent that is in Haiti now. What we found, or what I found through Freedom of Information Act requests, was that USAID, through one of their big contractors, Comonix, had actually provided some support and hand tools and things like that to a group called Mouvement Tête Calais. Now, as you know, their current political party is the Parti Haitian Tête Calais. Tête Calais is the sort of nickname of Martelli. And what that document showed was that this money came right after the election, and while they denied that it was political to me and said this was not a political group, documents that have come out actually passed after this article came out directly show the U.S. referring to the organization as being founded by Martelli campaign members. I think, as Francois was mentioning, part of the reason for this delay has been on the part of Martelli. I think he's been emboldened by that support he got from the international community in 2010 and 2011. It's allowed him some latitude to rule not as democratically, certainly, as many here would like to see.
Now, the obvious follow-up question is why? Francois, why does the U.S. in particular support the Martelli administration?
Well, I think the U.S. government had a different agenda than what existed in Haiti. First, the U.S. government and the other international members of the international community really wanted to restructure Haiti's economic problems by looking at the mines, by looking at the other investments, such as the industrial park in Caracol, land reform, administrative reform, economic reform, financial reform. So as a result, they were hoping that if they could get rid of the last issues of the last movement, they can use Martelli as a vanguard to be able to do those changes. But what really happened is that Martelli was not able to deliver. The longer they waited, hoping that Martelli might be able to deliver, the more problems they got. And at the end, Martelli wanted to control the electoral council. The members of parliament did not want him to do that. So there was a clash between the members of parliament and Martelli, and the U.S. administration, its ambassador, said clearly that she wanted only one election in Haiti, and that was going to be late, not sooner. So as a result, that's why it took so long for the elections to happen. And at the end, if you look at it, the U.S. failed to make any fundamental change with Martelli. The UN also failed to bring in any real change. In fact, since the UN has been in Haiti, this is one of the worst elections we've had since 2006, when the UN began to run the election in the country. Because of the violence, we've never had that level of violence in the previous elections that took place in Haiti.
Okay, and we don't have the results, but they're expected in about 8 to 10 days, I believe. Jake, what has been, just really quickly, the response of the international community? Are they saying that these election results are going to be honored?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a real divergence between what I've certainly heard from my contacts throughout the country who are observing the election, as well as what I saw here in the Capitol, which is that these problems were widespread. And yet the international community, I actually just came from the OAS press conference where they announced their preliminary findings. And in short, it's good enough, and good enough for who, right? Good enough for Haitians? I don't think many people here think it was good enough. And I think, everyone's sort of in wait and see mode to see when the results come out, what they'll look like. And that's really going to be the determiner of what happens next.
All right, Jake Johnston, as well as Francois Pierre-Louis joining us from Haiti. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.